You have asked me to teach dependent origination, and ever since you brought the chart from Malaysia, you wanted to understand it more. And every time when you asked me, I said, not now. That was because you need a knowledge of Abhidhamma to understand the dependent origination properly and correctly. And then at one time I gave talks to you on the basics of Abhidhamma. So after those talks I thought it might be time to teach dependent origination to you. But there is one more thing you need to understand, and that is Patthana, which is part of Abhidhamma. And it is important that when you study dependent origination, you study it along with the Patthana conditions. Because without Patthana conditions, you may misunderstand the relationship between links in the teaching of dependent origination. And so you may misunderstand or you may not understand properly. So it is also important that you have a basic understanding of Patthana also. Both dependent origination and Patthana teach the law of cause and effect. But there is a difference between method of teaching. The dependent origination teaches that, say, A is a condition for B to arise, or B arises dependent upon A, and then B is a condition for C, and C arises dependent upon A, and so on. So it teaches that, say, A is related to B and B is related to C. So it teaches that nothing arises out of nothing. So whenever something arises, it depends upon some other thing for its arising. But Patthana teaches more than that. Patthana teaches that, says, something is a condition for some other thing, or say A is a condition for B, and in addition it teaches how, say, A and B are related. So it is not just saying A and B are related, but it teaches that A and B are related, say, in some way. So in the way they are related. I think an analogy would be, with the help of an analogy, it would be easier to understand. So if I say Mr. A is related to Mr. B, it is like dependent origination. But just knowing that Mr. A and B are related is not enough. How they are related. So Patthana is like saying Mr. A and Mr. B are related as, say, father and son, or as an elder brother and younger brother, or as a relative, as a friend, or as cousins, and so on. So Patthana adds the mode of relationship between the two, in addition to saying that they are related. So tonight and tomorrow I will talk on the very basics of Patthana, so that you get just enough knowledge of Patthana to understand dependent origination fully and correctly. Now I say the very basics because Patthana is the biggest of the 7 books of Abhidhamma, the longest and the most comprehensive of these 7 books of Abhidhamma. Now, in the Burmese edition of Abhidhamma Pitaka, there are 12 volumes. And Patthana alone occupies 5 volumes. And the other 6 books comprise how many? 7 volumes. So Patthana is the longest of the 7 books of Abhidhamma. And it is described in the commentaries that Patthana is bigger than the great ocean. Now the ocean is very big and you cannot see the coast of the ocean, but still the ocean is limited by the coast. Patthana has no limit. It's very wide and very comprehensive and very deep. So we cannot cover, say, Patthana in 1 talk or 2 talks, or even if we spend 2-3 years, we may not cover the Patthana in its entirety. So during these 2 days, I will give you the very basics or very fundamentals of Patthana so that you can understand, you can get enough understanding of Patthana in order to understand the dependent origination. In the book of Abhidhamma, in the book of Patthana, Buddha taught what are known as 24 conditions. Here conditions mean something that produces some other thing, and something that supports some other thing, and something that both produces and supports some other thing. So all these 3 kinds of things are called conditions here, or in Pali they are called paccaya. Now these 24 conditions are given on a sheet distributed to you, and we'll go through them one by one. And I want you to memorize these 24 conditions, both in Pali and in English. The first of them is called Hetu paccaya, and the English translation is root condition. Now, I hope you know what roots are. What are the roots? There are 6 roots, right? Lobha, dosa, moha, and alobha, adosa, amoha, right? So alobha, adosa, amoha are the opposites of lobha, dosa, and moha respectively. Just as the roots of a tree keep the tree stable and firm, so these hetus, or these mental states, keep the concomitants firm object. So that is why they are called roots or hetu. For example, when you are attached to something, some object, then your mind is stuck to that object. Your mind is firmly on that object because of lobha arising together with the consciousness. So lobha is like a root there. Now you know when lobha arises, it arises together with other mental states, and also it accompanies the consciousness. So when there is an incidence of a consciousness accompanied by lobha, we can understand that there is the relationship of hetu in that case. In the case of consciousness accompanied by lobha and other concomitants, then lobha is the root condition, and the others, the other mental states and consciousness, are those that are conditioned by lobha. So their lobha is related to the concomitants by way of root condition. When you practice meditation, a wholesome consciousness arises in your mind. And that wholesome consciousness is accompanied by how many roots? 3 roots, or sometimes maybe 2 roots, the opposite of lobha, dosa and moha. So in that case, if you take alobha as a condition, then the consciousness and the other concomitants are those that are conditioned. Then if you take adosa as condition, then the other mental states and consciousness are the conditioned things. If you take amoha, the last one, as condition, then the others are conditioned. So here also, alobha is related to the other concomitants and consciousness by way of hetu condition. The same with adosa and amoha. Now when you see something, there is seeing consciousness in your mind. And seeing consciousness is said to be not accompanied by any of the roots. So in the case of seeing consciousness and its concomitants, there can be no root condition. So they are related not by way of root condition. Okay, what is the second root? Aramana pacchaya, object condition. So when you, let's say, when you see something, then there is the thing which is seen, and there is the seeing consciousness. Along with seeing consciousness, there are other mental states. Now, what is seen is an object condition for the seeing consciousness. That means seeing consciousness arises only when there is something to be seen. So that something to be seen, or what is seen, is an object condition for the seeing consciousness to arise. So seeing consciousness and what is seen are related by way of object condition. You hear something and there is hearing consciousness in your mind. So how are they related? They are related by object condition, right? And you smell something. So there is smell and there is smelling consciousness. They are related by way of object condition. You taste something, and so there is the tasting consciousness, or consciousness that knows the taste. So they are related by object consciousness. And you touch something, and there is a thing touched, and there is the consciousness, touching consciousness. So they are related by object condition. Then you think of something in your mind. So something you think of and the mind with which you think, they are related by object condition. Since everything in the world is the object, there can be object condition anywhere in the world. When you are aware of an object, or when you know an object, we say that your mind takes that thing as an object. So the object can be matter, or it can be mental things also, mind also. So everything in the world is object. Now the next paccaya is adhipati. Paccaya, or predominance condition. The meaning of the word adhipati is an overlord. And there can be only one lord at a time. Now there are two kinds of the predominance condition. Now when you see the Buddha is exercising predominance condition on your mind. That means for Buddhists, Buddha, or the object of the statue of Buddha, is a very desirable object, or very strong object. So when your mind takes the Buddha as an object, you take the Buddha intensely, or the Buddha exercise, the statue of the Buddha exercises firmly on your mind. And so that is called predominance, object predominance. So there are objects which are not just ordinary objects, but which are very desirable objects. So when the object is very desirable, there is this kind of relation between the object and the mind that takes that object as an object. And that is predominance, object predominance relationship. Also, sometimes you are very much attached to something. You want to possess it very much. You think of it all the time. So in that case, that object becomes the predominant object for your mind. And so the relationship between that object and your mind is of predominance condition. It's predominance between the object and the mind that takes the object. Now there is another kind of predominance, and that is predominance among those that arise together, that arise at the same time, or that exist at the same time. Four predominant mental states. Any of you remember those four predominant mental states? Adhipati, yeah. Chanda, will to do. Virya, right? Effort. Citta, consciousness. And vimansa, wisdom or knowledge. So these four are called predominant states. So one of these four can dominate all other mental states. So when one is very predominant, for example, you have a very strong desire, not attachment, but very strong desire, say, very strong desire to practice meditation, then that desire, that wholesome desire becomes predominant. So in that case, that becomes a predominant condition, and the other mental states concomitant with it becomes those that are conditioned by it. So in that case, this predominance is called co-nascent predominance. That means predominance between mental factors, mental things arising together. Also the effort, consciousness, or knowledge can become a predominant factor. But they can be predominant only one at a time, because they are like head of states. So there can be only one head of state at a time. There can be only one president at a time. So in the same way, there can be only one predominant factor at a time. So any one of these four may be predominant at one time, and at that time, say, their relationship is by way of predominant condition. So there are two kinds of predominance. One is object predominance, and the other is cognizance predominance. So object predominance means very strong object exercising its influence over the mind. And cognizance predominance means something predominant among its concomitants. The next one is what? Anantara, right? And the English translation is proximity. Now, English translation by itself may not make much meaning, but they are convenient when we want to refer to that condition. But we have to understand the real meaning of the word. So the English word proximity means what? To be close, right? Near. But the word anandara does not mean close or near. Anandara means no gap, no intervening Dhamma. So antara means a gap or interim, and na means no. So anandara means no gap, no intervening Dhamma. Now, you know, the consciousness arises, and then one consciousness arises, and it disappears, and immediately after that another consciousness arises, and then it disappears, and then there is another consciousness. So the arising and disappearing, the disappearance of consciousness, one consciousness occurs one after another, without interruption, without stop. All through, not only all through this life, all through the samsara, until one becomes an arahant and gain final deliverance. Now, when one consciousness arises, it lasts for a very brief moment. It arises and then it disappears. Immediately after its disappearance, another consciousness arises. So between the first consciousness and second consciousness, there is no gap. There is nothing intervening between them. And the first consciousness, or rather the disappearance of first consciousness, is what is called here anandara condition, proximity condition. That means it gives place to the next consciousness to arise. If the first consciousness does not disappear, then the second consciousness will not get chance to arise. So it is something like you give this seat to another person. So long as you are on this seat, another person cannot take this seat. So you move away, you make yourself disappear from that seat, and then another person can take that seat. So that is what is meant by anandara condition, proximity condition. So giving up your say, position or something so that another can take your place. There is another condition only between different moments of consciousness. Now when we teach thought process, we use a diagram. Say, the diagram contains moments of consciousness one after another. So sometimes students think that the thought process occurs as a connected line, but actually it is not that way. In moments there is only one type, one consciousness, and the next moment this consciousness disappears, and in its place there is another consciousness. So at one time there is only one consciousness, not say 17 thought moments arising at the same time. But we use a diagram, just let students understand that this is one thought process, this is one group of types of consciousness functioning together, taking one common object. But in reality, no two consciousness, no two types of consciousness arise at the same moment. So at a given moment, there is, let us say, number one consciousness. And then it disappears. And in its place, there is number two consciousness. Then it disappears, and there is in its place number three consciousness, and so on. So anandara condition is actually one consciousness disappearing so that another consciousness can arise. So we will come to the disappearance condition later. So disappearance and here, say, proximity or whatever the English translation is, they are actually the same. So when something is an anandara condition, it is also a disappearance condition. They are the same. Before, say, number one consciousness disappears, number two consciousness cannot arise. So for the number two consciousness to arise, number one consciousness disappears. So the anandara condition is the same as disappearance condition. And the next one is samanantara condition. Samanantara condition is identical with anandara condition. So there is no difference in essence between anandara condition and samanantara condition. But why is there samanantara condition if anantara and samanantara are identical? Now it is explained in our commentaries that when Buddha taught, he taught taking into consideration well acquainted with the name anantara, but others may be well acquainted with the word samanantara. That depends on their past experience. So Buddha took into consideration the temperament of his listeners, and to suit the different temperaments of his listeners, he used different names for, say, one and the same condition or one and the same thing. That is why there are some repetitions, say, even in these 24 conditions. Okay, the next one is Sahajada Pacchaya, co-nascence condition. Now Saha means together, and Jada means to arise and to exist. So Sahajada means arising together or existing together. So in order to have this type of condition, then things must be together, things must arise together, and they must exist together. And then one is taken to be the condition, and the others are those that are conditioned. For example, let's take consciousness and mental factors. One consciousness arises, and along with that consciousness there are mental factors. Now we take consciousness as Sahajada, condition, and mental factors as those that are conditioned by consciousness. Or we can pick up one mental state, cetasika, as conditioned, and the other cetasikas and consciousness as those that are conditioned. Must arise and exist at the same time. They must be present at a given time. Since the basis of this condition is arising and existing together, there can be sahajata condition between mind and mind, between mind and matter, and between matter and matter. Because matter, different particles of matter also arise together and exist together. And mind and matter also, some matter also arise together and exist together. So there can be sahajata condition between mind and mind, mind and matter, matter and matter. When things arise together, sometimes one is always the conditioning and the others are always conditioned. But at other times, they can be conditions mutually. That means they can be conditioned for each other or conditioned for one another. So when there is such a reciprocal conditioning, then we call it the number 7, anyamanya pacaya, or mutuality condition. We can call it reciprocal or mutual. To get the anyamanya condition, then the things involved must also arise together and exist together. And existing together, they help each other. So the anyamanya condition is narrower in scope than sahajata condition. Things may arise together, but they may not necessarily be conditioned for each other. One may be the conditioned and the other may be always the conditioned. But with regard to anyamanya, then one can be conditioned. When one is conditioned, the other is conditioned. And when the other is conditioned, then the one is conditioned. So there can be reciprocal conditioning in this pacaya, anyamanya pacaya. Now I hope you know the 28 material properties, 28 rupas. Even if you don't know the 28, I hope you know among them 4 are primary elements, and the 24 are those that are dependent on those 24, on those 4. So they arise together and they exist together. So there is a sahajata condition between them. But there is no anyamanya condition between the primaries and the dependent ones. Since they are dependent ones, they are always dependent on the primaries. So between primaries and dependent ones, there is no anyamanya condition, but there is sahajata condition. But among the 4 primaries themselves, one can be the condition and the other 3 can be conditioned. So in that case, there is reciprocal or anyamanya condition. So that is the difference between sahajata condition and anyamanya condition. So even in one arising of material properties, there can be only sahajata condition between so and so rupas, and also there can be anyamanya condition between the other material properties. And it is said that there can be mutual condition only between mind and mind, and matter and matter. So there can be no mutual condition between mind and matter. So they do not condition reciprocally. Now the next condition is nisaya paccaya, support condition. Now nisaya means something on which you depend, something on which you rely. So when you are sitting on a seat, the seat is your nisaya. So when you are leaning against a wall, then the wall is your nisaya. So nisaya means something you depend on, something you rely on. So that can be a support. So that is why it is translated as support condition or dependent condition. Now when you see something, there is a thing to be seen. There is the seeing consciousness, and there are the eyes. Now, seeing consciousness depends on what is to be seen. That means if there is nothing to be seen, seeing consciousness will not arise. So, the object which is seen is a support condition or nisaya condition for seeing consciousness. And also, seeing consciousness depends upon your eyes. If you have no eyes, you will not see. Seeing consciousness will not arise. So, the eyes, or to be exact, the sensitive parts in the eye. So, the sensitive eye is also a nisaya condition for seeing consciousness. Is the nisaya as object, the other is nisaya as a base. And between things arising together, there is also this support condition. Now, consciousness and mental states arise together. And when one supports the other, then that supporter is nisaya condition for the other mental states. The support condition can be understood in two ways. The support as cognizance, support, say, among things that arise together, and support between things that arise before the thing that is conditioned arise. I'll explain it later. So nisaya condition can be between those that arise together and also between those that arise at different times. Now, when you see there is a seeing consciousness, and I said that seeing consciousness depends on the eye. Now, the eye arose before seeing consciousness arises. So when seeing consciousness arises, it depends on the I, which has already arisen and which is still existing. So that kind of support is called, say, pre-nascent support. We'll come to pre-nascence later. So kinds of support here. Support between things arising together and support between things that arose at different times. The next condition is upanisaya, and it is translated as decisive support. Now, the upa in the word upanisaya means powerful or strong. So upanisaya means strong support, strong nisaya. This upanisaya can be found in those that are anantara condition and those that are object condition. Now when an object, consciousness takes an intense object, and there is said to be this powerful nisya condition in the object. So in that case, there is the upanisya condition between the object and the mind that takes that object as an object. And it is also said to be found in those related by anantara, related by proximity. So one or the preceding, let's say, consciousness. The preceding consciousness is, or the disappearance of the preceding consciousness is a strong support for the next consciousness to arise. So there is said to be the upanisya condition between those that have anandara condition also. And there is a third kind of upanisya, which is actually very wide. According to that condition, everything in the world can be the third upanisya condition. All consciousness, mental factors, and rupas. It is rather an influence, actually. And so, kusala can influence akusala, and akusala can influence kusala. Now, influenced by kusala, you may do akusala. And influenced by akusala, you may do kusala. Influenced by means taking that as an object, thinking about that. Now, for example, you did something wrong in the past, so that was akusala. Now you think of that akusala, and you try to counterbalance that akusala by doing kusala now. So your kusala now is influenced by your akusala in the past. So that akusala is said to be the upanisya condition for your kusala now. You do something good and you get kusala. And later on, depending on that kusala, you may have some akusala. Suppose you offer something to a person whom you think is very virtuous, and then later you found out him to be, say, a wicked person, and so you are disappointed, and so that disappointment is akusala. And that akusala is conditioned by the saddha, generosity you practiced to that person. So this third upanisya condition is very wide, and it can be applied to almost all or any condition in the world. A friend also can be this kind of upanisya condition. Depending on a friend, you may do something, some akusala, or you may do some kusala. So your akusala or kusala is conditioned by that friend. Sometimes your kusala and akusala may be conditioned by food. So you eat some food, and that food may cause you to get kusala or akusala, depending on, say, how you eat it. And also climate or weather. Sometimes the weather is too hot and you are angry and you have akusala. Sometimes it is good and then you feel good, then you have another kind of akusala. Or sometimes you can take weather just as it comes and without any like or dislike, and then you get maybe kusala with regard to weather. So with regard to this, the third kind of upanisya, even the outside things can become the condition. Even they can condition or they can influence, say, your mind, and you get kusala or akusala depending on these things. Since it is so wide that it comes as an easy way to explain It's a relationship. If we cannot think of any other relationship, we just say, oh, it must be that Upanishya, because nothing can escape this that Upanishya. But there is another Upanishya wider in scope than the Upanishya we are talking now, and that is called Sotanta Upanishya. So there are two kinds of Upanishya, Abhidhamma Upanishya and Sotanta Upanishya. According to Sotanta Upanishya, anything can be condition of anything. So that is wider. So if we cannot find Abhidhamma relationship, Abhidhamma Upanishya relationship, we can say, oh, it is according to Sotanta Upanishya. So it is an easy way of explaining things. The next is Purijata, pre-naissance. I've already explained Purijata in connection with Nisaya, right? So Puri means before, and Jata means, say, arising or existing. So what it means here is that which has arisen before and which is still existing. Now in Abhidhamma, it is taught that matter lives longer than mind. So matter lives 17 times longer than consciousness of matter factors. So when we say we see an object, we mean there is the seeing consciousness. Now before the arising of that seeing consciousness, the thing we see arose. So when we really see the object, it has, say, lived for, say, 3 or 4 moments. So it arises before the seeing consciousness arises. So the relationship between the object which is seen and the consciousness which sees is, in this case, by way of pre-nascence. The object arose before the seeing consciousness arises. The same with the eye sensitivity. So eye sensitivity also arose before seeing consciousness arises. When seeing consciousness arises, it depends on that eye sensitivity which is already there, which has already arisen and is still existing. Now, before existing condition, so that is translated as pre-nascence. I hope you will notice that when there is Purijata condition, there is also Nisaya condition. The eye consciousness depends on the visible object, or it depends on the eye sensitivity. So both visible object and eye sensitivity serve as a base for the seeing consciousness to arise. So seeing consciousness is related to the object seen by way of, or we can say the object is related to seeing consciousness by way of Nisaya as well as Purijata. And also the eye sensitivity is related to eye consciousness, seeing consciousness by way of Nisaya, or support, as well as by pre-nascence or Purijata. And also I think you notice that in order to be related by way of Nisaya and Purijata, they must be existing at the same time. If they are not existing at the same time, there can be no condition or no relation as Nisaya or Purijata. So whenever there is Nisaya or Purijata, there is also another condition, number 21. So we'll come to that later. Now the next one is Paccā Jata. Paccā means after, and Jata means arising. So it is a condition which arises after the one which is conditioned. It is the opposite of Puri Jata. So in Puri Jata, the condition arises first, and then what is conditioned arises later. But here, what is to be conditioned arises first, and then what will condition arises later. And in this relation, it is said that only Ceta and Cetasikas are conditioning, and Rupa is conditioned. That means Rupa has already arisen and existing when consciousness arises, and then it supports the material qualities to exist. So mind can support, so mind can influence matter which has already arisen and which is still existing at the time the mind arises. And so when they are related that way, they are said to be related by way of Paccā Jata condition. This condition is explained in the commentaries by an analogy of a species of vultures. It is said that in that species, the parent birds do not feed the young vultures, but these young vultures always have the expectation that their parents will bring food to them, but they never get the real food. But their body is sustained, it is said in our books, by that expectation. So that expectation supports their physical body until they are old enough to find food for themselves. Okay, how many have we finished? 11. I think we must stop here. So we'll continue tomorrow.